Right, so in part one, we went from the early Industrial Revolution through to the formation of the Labour Party and up to 1945 and the election of the first Labour government that actually had a parliamentary majority. So this is part two, which should take us up just before Neil Kinnock gets elected as a leader. Why isn't it doing anything? Now. Good start. Right. Nothing's happening. Hang on. You might have to edit this.
So Labour went into the July 1945 election on the back of Let's Face the Future, a manifesto that fell well short of committing the party to full nationalisation and ignored the appeals for some form of industrial democracy involving workers' control. The Labour leadership had not wanted an election, and Attlee and Bevin wanted to accept an offer of continuation of the coalition given by Churchill, but they were overruled by the Labour National Executive. The Labour leadership did not think they could win. This is despite the gains made during the war by parties that did not accept the electoral truce, especially the 4 seats won in the by-elections by the left-wing Commonwealth Party. In the event, there was a landslide victory for Labour with a parliamentary majority of 147, and for the first time they were able to form a government free from reliance on other parties. There was an immediate blow when the American government announced the end of the Lend-Lease aid agreed during the war. Maynard Keynes was sent to the United States to negotiate a new loan, but the terms imposed by the Americans were harsh. The Americans had emerged from the war with a dominance equal to mid-19th century Britain, and they were determined to keep it. Much has been said about the post-war Labour government, and it is rightly praised for the establishment of the welfare state. There was a consensus across the political spectrum on the need for change. It was Honorin Bevin, the most left-wing member of the cabinet, who was responsible for establishing the National Health Service. There was some Tory and medical opposition to the scale and breadth of the NHS. Bevin appeased the doctors by not insisting on them being a salaried service, and consultants were allowed to keep their private patients and have paid beds allocated to them in NHS hospitals. He also backed down on plans to include provision for birth control under the health service. The Conservatives' behaviour in trying to sabotage his project left him livid, and Bevin's natural hatred for them was undeniable. At a Labour rally in 1948, he set out his forthright views. So far as I am concerned, they are lower than vermin. They condemn millions of people to semi-starvation. The comments were considered scandalous, but Bevin was unapologetic. The National Insurance Act 1946 provided sickness and unemployment benefits for adults, plus retirement pensions. The National Assistance Act 1948 provided a safety net for anyone not otherwise covered. More council housing was built, and plans were made through the New Towns Act of 1946 for the growth of suburbs and to reduce the overcrowding in major cities such as London and Glasgow. The Attlee government nationalised about 20% of the economy, including coal, railways, road transport, the Bank of England, civil aviation, electricity and gas, and finally steel. However, there was no money for investment to modernise, and there was no effort made to turn control over to the workforce in these industries. Unfortunately, most of this 20% of the economy encompassed the most unprofitable part of it, yet the previous owners received amounts in compensation for the nationalisation of their dilapidated and failing industries. The mines cost the taxpayer 164 million, for example, and the railways 1 billion. There was anger on the shop floor over the manner in which the nationalisation was carried out. Old management structures remained intact. Jobs for the boys at the top of the public sector replicated the old class structures of the privatised industries. Bullying was rife, and the tensions between workers and managers remained, as workers did not feel they had any real say in how the companies were run. Between 1947 and 1951, there were over 8,000 unofficial strikes in the newly state-owned companies. The dilapidated nature of the companies prior to nationalisation contributed to the sense that state control was inefficient and bureaucratic, an argument that Margaret Thatcher and others were to deploy successfully in the 1980s. When the agreement between the union leaders and the Labour leaders failed to stop workers taking action over wages or working conditions, the Attlee government's attitude was that strikes against a Labour government were unacceptable. It did not hesitate to use the army to break strikes. Between 1945 and 51, the army was used on 18 separate occasions to break strikes. The notorious strike-breaking Supply and Transport Organisation was secretly re-established. When the government turned to the nationalisation of the very lucrative steel industry in 1948, it exposed the limits of consent, and opposition came from business, the House of Lords, the steel industry itself, and was tantamount to a concerted action to sabotage an Act of Parliament. The opposition ground down the nationalisation bill and the political will to implement it. When steel was eventually nationalised in the final phase of the Labour government in 1950, it was only a half-hearted attempt. In 1951, it was very easy for the new Conservative government to put iron and steel back into the private sector. The outcome of the fight over steel nationalisation was the Parliament Act of 1949, which limited the ability of the Lords to interfere with the Commons. This fell well short of the more radical proposals agreed in the 1930s that would abolish the Lords entirely, but in truly British fashion, Attlee decided only to tinker around the edges. Now we'll look at the foreign policy of the Attlee government. And as the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe and pro-Stalinist regimes were installed, some in the Labour Party still saw in Stalin and Joseph Tito in Yugoslavia as comrades in the cause of socialism. Others were repelled by the obvious crimes of Stalinism, openly denouncing the dictatorships in Eastern Europe. A third group believed that Labour could better negotiate and work with the Soviet Union, unlike Churchill, who favoured confrontation. The election pledge was to mediate between Washington and Moscow to help ensure good post-war relations. However, a belligerent attitude had developed in the Labour cabinet, spearheaded by the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, that aligned itself with the United States. Bevin was to play a crucial role in establishing NATO as a means of counteracting the Soviet Union. He was happy to spend money on continuing conscription and establishing permanent army bases in Europe. Criticism came from those who wanted to decrease military spending to fund housing, education, better health services, and so on. And all the things that people were expecting from a Labour government. Unknown at the time, Attlee's cabinet had agreed in secret to build a nuclear weapon. Bevin spoke enthusiastically of wanting an atomic bomb. "We have to get this thing, whatever it costs. We've got to have a bloody Union Jack on top of it," he said. In the 1950 general election, Labour was returned to power, but with a reduced majority of 5. It had campaigned on basically the same programme as 1945, with little in the way of new policy or ideas, and was immediately embroiled in the opening of hostilities in Korea. The Korean conflict saw President Truman appeal to the UN and in particular Britain to back up the US intervention in the South. Attlee proposed cutting back on social policy as a calculated sacrifice to support British involvement. Under pressure from the United States, Attlee agreed to a 3-year rearmament programme that would increase the UK's military expenditure to 7.5% of GDP. To help pay for the increase in military spending, Hugh Gaitskell introduced a bill that proposed taking dental and eye treatment off the NHS. Bevan felt he had no choice but to resign. He saw the cuts as a betrayal of the founding principle of the NHS that would provide health care from cradle to grave. Labour's imperial policy differed from the Conservatives in rhetoric, but not in actual practice. The Labour government inherited military intervention in Greece, although Attlee and Bevin continued the policy of royalist restoration they had supported as members of the coalition. Troops were sent to Indochina to help restore French rule, and to the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, to help the Dutch. In both cases, the British came into conflict with the independence movement that had fought the Japanese, and in both cases, Japanese POWs were rearmed and used alongside British troops. The British were so impressed with the Japanese commander in Indonesia that he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Order. Such an award would, of course, have been political dynamite at the time, when British prisoners were being liberated from Japanese camps, and would have drawn unwelcome attention to the Labour government's policy of imperial restoration. Both Attlee and Bevin lied to the House of Commons about the extent of use of Japanese troops. During the war, the Malayan communists were allies, with their leaders honoured by the British government. At the end of the war, the communists focused their efforts on building up a strong trade union movement and a constitutional broad left alliance, uniting Malays, Chinese and Indians. The growth of a militant left in Malaya was not acceptable to the Labour government. Malaya's tin and rubber were vital for the British economic recovery. In 1948, Malayan rubber and tin earned more money than all of Britain's own exports. Strikes were broken, left-wing newspapers were closed, and left-wing activists were imprisoned. This precipitated a communist insurgency in 1948 and the introduction of a state of emergency. The British policy was to crush the insurgency by means of brutality and intimidation. Villages were burned down, torture was commonplace, and prisoners were routinely shot while trying to escape. This culminated in the Batang Kali massacre of December 1948, in which 24 Chinese unarmed civilians were killed, a matter that the Labour government successfully covered up. The British tactics in Malaya were later consciously copied by the Americans in Vietnam. There was a similar pattern of development in Africa, where the Labour government's refusal to challenge the power of the white settlers precipitated rebellion, especially in Kenya and Nigeria. Independence movements were condemned as communists, while substantial support was given to the white Rhodesians, for example, who had established a system of apartheid similar to the one in South Africa. It is the granting of Indian independence that has enhanced the reputation of Attlee's government's imperial policy. This, though, covers up what the Attlee government intended. They wanted to concede independence to a fragmented India princely states that would still be, in effect, part of Britain's informal empire. They wanted to keep military bases in the country, including air bases from which the Soviet Union could be bombed, and that Indian troops would still be available to fight for the empire. This was unacceptable to the Indian Congress, and increasing popular unrest threatened an eventual explosion in which the Indian army might side with the rebels. As late as January 1947, Ernest Bevin was arguing that Congress should be suppressed and any rebellion put down in order to ensure that India's resources and territory remain in British hands. Attlee, however, recognised that Britain just did not have either the men or the materiel to remain in occupation of the country. It was the threat of revolution or war that persuaded the British government to withdraw, while successfully selling it as an act of great liberal statesmanship. The Labour Party's commitment to Zionism dated back to 1917, and by 1945, Labour was committed to the population transfer in Palestine, with the Palestinian population being encouraged to move out so that Zionist settlers could move in. While the Labour leadership was quite prepared to see Jewish settlers displace the Palestine population, they had no intention of allowing Jewish refugees, the survivors of the Holocaust, into Britain. This continued the policy of the Churchill coalition government, even though a chronic post-war shortage of labour saw some 200,000 East Europeans welcomed into the country. Additionally, the Labour government was also determined to repatriate people from the Caribbean who had either come to Britain as war workers or who had served in the armed services. Attlee called a snap election for Thursday, 25th of October 1951, in the hope of increasing Labour's parliamentary majority. But despite increasing their share of the vote and polling more than the Conservatives, Labour was defeated and the Conservatives were returned with a 17-seat majority. The Labour Party wrongly assumed that the Conservatives would try to roll back their achievements and they would soon be returned to office. As it was, the Conservatives had recognised the mood of the country and were content to only make modest changes to nationalisation and health service. This post-war consensus lasted until 1979. The centrist consensus on the economic policy of this period from 1945 up to the early 1960s is generally known as Buskalism, derived from the names of the Conservative Chancellor from 1951 to 55, Rab Butler, and his Labour predecessor, Hugh Gaitskell. Following the defeat in 1951, Attlee continued to lead the party, although many Labour MPs felt that he should have retired after the election and allowed a younger man to lead. The period was dominated by infighting between the right and left of the party, led by Hugh Gaitskell and Owen Bevan, respectively. One of the main reasons for Attlee staying on as leader was to frustrate the leadership ambitions of Herbert Morrison, whom he disliked for both political and personal reasons. After the loss in the 1955 election, he did retire and Hugh Gaitskell was elected leader. The main differences of opinion within the Labour Party revolved around Britain's foreign policy and especially its nuclear deterrent. Many on the left became involved with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, and at the 1960 Labour Party conference, a motion was passed supporting unilateral disarmament. Hugh Gaitskell managed to get the decision reversed the following year with the support of the Union bloc vote. Gateskill was thwarted in his attempt to abolish Clause 4 in 1960, when and a new organisation, the Young Socialists, became a centre for dissent. From its inception, there were two competing groups vying for leadership. The first was the Socialist League, later become the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and the second was a collaboration between the International Socialists and the Revolutionary Socialist League, later become the Socialist Workers' Party and militant. The first Young Socialist Conference in 1961 ignored a ban on discussing certain topics and passed a range of motions on nationalisation, leaving NATO, withdrawal of troops from the colonies, and unilateralism. They also overwhelmingly passed a motion calling on Gateskill to resign, which infuriated the Labour leader. The NEC responded by expelling the leading YS organiser, and several left-wing members of the Young Socialist National Committee were suspended. The election of the new Labour government in 1964 finally ended 13 years in opposition. Labour faced quite a challenge concerning the economy, as a period of full employment, high wages and rising living standards was fading. The Tories had been ousted mainly on the basis of people's fears about the slowing down of the economy, and Wilson promised big things on the key issues of the economy, jobs and wages. Harold Wilson had become leader in 1963 and had fought the 1964 election on a popular programme to appeal to the new middle classes. The battleground was not ideological anymore, but the new tactic had been to attack the Tories for their lack of competence in managing capitalism. The Conservatives were depicted as stale and incompetent, whereas Labour would bring in new technicians, younger managers, more socially aware executives, and introduce the white heat of technology. Labour had a razor-thin majority of only 4, and MPs were whipped into line to support the government. On unruly constituency Labour parties were advised to keep their criticisms private so as not to destabilise the government. Wilson called another election in 1966 and successfully consolidated a much healthier majority in Parliament. There were significant social changes during this time. Bills were introduced to relax or decriminalise a whole host of repressive legislation, including divorce, abortion, homosexuality, and capital punishment, even though personally Wilson did not fully approve of this. Changes to the education system saw the expansion of comprehensive schools, with the 11+ exam being abolished. Higher education was massively expanded, with students given maintenance grants and the creation of the Open University. The 1966 Doctors' Charter radically improved pay scales for doctors and was the beginning of the modern GP surgeries. There was a big investment in roads, an extension of the motorway system, as well as far-sighted road safety measures like the introduction of seatbelts. Changes to the tax system helped people on low and middle incomes. Although prescription charges were abolished in 1965, they were reintroduced at an even higher rate in 1968. Jobs and economic growth failed to materialise as the pound suffered from currency speculation, and international pressure grew on Labour to make cuts to spending. Rumblings on the left of the party grew again as Labour introduced deflationary measures that cut living standards for working families and supported immigration controls from the Commonwealth for the first time. Wilson's method to keep the party together was his shrewd manipulation of the Labour left. He knew how to play them to get the result he wanted. A number of methods were used. Firstly, ambiguity. Hugh Gateskill had tried to get rid of Clause 4, but Wilson maintained his ambiguity between the left's commitment to symbols like Clause 4 and the right's commitment to a capitalist mixed economy. continued with confusion and evasion surrounded much of Labour's policy. Secondly, incorporation. Wilson sought to stifle critical voices in the PLP, using tactics of offering ministerial seats to MPs who might otherwise cause problems. Thirdly, personal relations. Wilson's approach was often like a friend or friendly uncle. He displayed a sensitive understanding of their point of view and was always ready to get them on the first rung of the ministerial ladder. To the left, he was conciliatory, while in practice he implemented the policy agenda of the right. In Ireland, the sectarian discrimination in the partition north festered until the mid-1960s, when unrest exploded as a mass social movement emerged demanding reforms and social justice, leading to regular clashes with the Unionists. A police attack on a peaceful civil rights demonstration in 1968 was followed by an ambush in January 1969 by loyalists and off-duty RUC officers on the People's Democracy March. The conflict came to a head in 1969 when the provocative march by up to 15,000 Orange Order apprentice boys led to 3 days of rioting. This was the start of what was euphemistically named the Troubles. In response, Wilson made the decision to deploy the British Army, until that point stationed in their barracks, to a policing role in the northern state. As the occupation spiraled out of control with Bloody Sunday in 1972 and the arrival of punitive anti-terrorist measures during the 1970s, opposition to the occupation of the North hardened, with organisations like Troops Out movement becoming a mobilising force, uniting activists from the Republican movement, the Labour left and revolutionary socialists. Many Irish people in the Labour Party and many workers from an Irish background were fiercely Republican, and they had a wide base of support in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow, with large Catholic populations. When the young Republican militant Bernadette Devlin was elected to Westminster just before her 22nd birthday, her staunch views on the Troubles contrasted sharply with the opinions of mainstream Labour MPs. She did, though, receive some loud and boisterous support from many of the Labour backbenchers during her speeches. Labour had initially opposed any immigration controls on Commonwealth citizens and had fought Tory legislation on this issue in the early 1960s. But there was a growing anti-immigrant racism, and in 1964, Labour lost a safe seat in Smethwick to a Tory, running on the infamous slogan of "If you want a N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour." The new bill was introduced in 1965, drastically restricting immigration. In 1967, the National Front was launched. Then, a year later, Tory MP Enoch Powell delivered his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, in which he predicted race riots and fall of Rome-style scenario unless immigration was checked. By then, Labour concluded that immigration could be their biggest vote loser, and this thinking sparked an increasingly desperate attempt to accommodate the growing racist populism, resulting in the 1968 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, further reducing rights of Commonwealth citizens to migrate to the UK. The industrial strategy developed by Barbara Castle in the White Paper In Place of Strife was designed to deal with the shop floor militancy. Wilson wanted to prove he could tame trade unions, in particular unofficial wildcat strikes. The solution was a corporatist one, to further integrate the unions into the affairs of state and giving them power as bureaucratic institutions rather than workers' movements. The proposals involved requiring official ballots and the cooling off period for strikes to give union officials time to step in and pacify the workforce, or for a deal to be worked out without the need for a strike. It was a blueprint for future anti-strike legislation. Michael Foot led the opposition in Parliament, attacking Wilson and Castle for bending to the press and scapegoating the unions. It met with resistance from trade union leaders, especially Jack Jones and Hugh Scanlon, who were furious at the intervention of Wilson and his cabinet into the union movement in such a way. The Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions organised a series of work stoppages and a strike on May Day 1968, involving 250,000 workers. Castle and the cabinet looked for a way out, and Scanlon and Jones offered them one. Abandon in place of strike in exchange for an agreement that the unions would self-police and prevent wildcat strikes through their own internal mechanisms. Labour had proposed introducing regulations that even the Tories had attempted since the war, and for a lot of activists and shop stewards on the factory floors, that was unforgivable. Around 200,000 members left the party during this period. Wilson has still hoped to win the 1970 general election. In some polls, he was even 7 points ahead on the eve of the election. But he was defeated by Ted Heath, who won with a 30-seat majority. It was during the Heath government that the Labour left began to revive and challenge leadership. Newly converted left-winger Tony Benn took up the demands of some of the most radical parts of the trade union movement and even critiqued his own recent past. There were three factors for this change. The first was industrial militancy that saw thousands of workers take unofficial action in protest at the imprisoning of the Pentonville five striking dock workers that were imprisoned under Heath's new anti-union laws. Secondly, the battles going on in the workplace up and down the country and the workers' occupation at the Upper Clyde shipbuilders in 1971 that saw a working and production under workers' control. The campaign forced the Tories to keep the shipyard open, saving 4,000 of the 6,000 jobs and providing a working model for new ways of putting some of the vague promises of Clause 4 into action. Thirdly, in local government, the surcharging and barring from office of Labour councillors in the Clay Cross in 1972-3, after they refused to implement the Heath's government's Housing Finance Act, which took control of rents out of the hands of local authorities and put them in the hands of Westminster. Their cause was celebrated throughout the Labour movement. Militant Tendency's goal was to transform Labour into a Marxist party. From 100 members in 1970, it grew rapidly to over 1,000 in the mid-70s. It grew primarily because they methodically organised Labour Party Young Socialist branches and integrated the branches into their own organisational work. The Labour Party Young Socialists gave them funds, influence, and a positions within the party, as each LPYS branch could send 2 delegates to their constituency Labour Party meetings. This gave militant a voice on local leaderships. They achieved greater success in Liverpool after leading the struggle against the old guard led by Bessie and Jack Braddock, who had run Liverpool as their own fiefdom. They had learned from the past, and when accused of being a party within a party, they claimed to be just a network of sellers of the militant newspaper. And the idea of harassing someone for selling a socialist newspaper was simply not very popular amongst ordinary Labour Party members. They weren't getting the vote out in marginal seats, and they were always very active in promoting the Labour Party. Most of militants' politics were, for the time, pretty standard Labour movement policies. A 35-hour week, a better minimum wage, more workers' control over hiring and firing, opposition to arms spending, and Tory anti-union laws. On some issues, militant were quite conservative. They weren't very enamoured with the women's movement, gay liberation, or black self-organisation. Their view was that these weren't working class issues and were devices for class unity. The National Union of Mine Workers had gone on strike against the Conservative government, resulting in a 3-day working week as coal supplies ran low. Heath called for an early election and lost, so Labour was back in power. The Labour manifesto, Let Us Work Together, was greatly influenced by Tony Benn and promised a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working class and their families. The manifesto also committed the party to renegotiating the terms of Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, now known as the EU, and to holding a national referendum on the issue. Harold Wilson refused to implement the more radical parts of the manifesto, and the left had no way to force him to. Once again, the tactic of putting leading lights of the left in the cabinet was used. Michael Foot was made Minister for Employment, and Tony Benn was given the Ministry of Industry, with Eric Heffer as his Undersecretary. Labour focused its energies on attempting to win the trade unions over to a social contract that would limit wage increases. In this regard, they were totally successful. Year on year, wage deals with the unions saw pay increases well below inflation. The number of official strikes also dropped dramatically. The promised referendum on membership of the EEC took place in June 1975. The terms of Britain's continued involvement were renegotiated by James Callaghan. The referendum was called on terms deeply unpopular with the left and against Labour Party policy. Tony Benn and his allies led the charge to get the UK out of the EEC, but the focus on national sovereignty and economic rights failed to convince the electorate, who saw in Europe a chance for more trade and better jobs. Wilson had called the referendum to isolate the left, and it worked. 32% voted to leave the EEC, and this defeat left Benn isolated and gave Wilson the opportunity to demote him to the much less influential Department of Energy. The social contract was living on borrowed time. Britain was hit by rising unemployment, stagflation, and a run on the pound. Afraid to confront the power of the City of London and given advice by the Treasury that he had no choice, Dennis Healey went cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a loan to the tune of £2.3 billion. The conditions of the loan required eye-watering cuts to public expenditure. Motions were passed at the next Labour Party conference that proposed an alternative economic strategy, but James Callaghan, who was now Prime Minister after Harold Wilson had stepped down, made it clear that these would be ignored. The voluntary wage policies agreed in 1976 unravelled in 1978. Trade unionists, led by the firefighters demanding a 30% pay increase, began to reject the incomes policy. It had been intended to prevent inflation, but it failed and led to the value of wages being reduced. This led to the winter of discontent that brought down Labour by a series of strikes. The austerity demands of the IMF, implemented by the Labour government, were the turning point. It set the Labour right on a course to accepting the subsequent Thatcher orthodoxy. Margaret Thatcher's victory in 1979 saw the Labour Party once again swing towards the left. The left now felt it was a moment to push for the constitutional reforms that would break up the Parliamentary Labour Party's domination. 3 central democratic reforms were sort of one: extending the franchise for the leadership elections to unions and members, giving the NEC control over the manifesto, and mandatory reselection of MPs were all enacted. Michael Foot was elected leader in 1980, and the following year the Gang of Four, Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, David Owen and the other fella, split to form the SDP. The media's growing loony left campaign that had begun with the SDP split saw them target people like Peter Tatchell and Ken Livingstone, as well as councils like Hackney, Liverpool and Lambeth. The militant tendency, LGBT rights, black sections, women's sections were also fair game. Even within the party, there was a nervous fear of the party being increasingly dominated by an obsession with so-called minority issues. It was Tony Benn who came to represent the loony left in the tabloids of media. After loyally supporting both the Wilson and Callaghan governments, he was moving it further to the left, but his vision was of an older radical tradition dating back to the Levellers. He presented a strange mix of radical liberalism and workers' control. He was a constitutionalist political reformer, but he was a threat to the interests of the establishment because when he spoke, many people listened. Benn joined the ranks of the Labour left MPs, alongside Corbyn and others, who were embedding campaigns and struggles from anti-apartheid to CND to strikes. He was a proponent of the extra parliamentary action, as long as it was not anti-parliamentary action. He came close to winning the deputy leader elections, achieving 49.6% to Dennis Healy's 50.4%. Benn had won 80% of the constituency Labour Party votes and 40% of the union votes. The narrow loss was made worse when many MPs who had backed Healy decamped to form the SDP only a few months later.
There you go.